recording. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the context and the router as it is already written in the schedule. There is already the schedule for next week. Next week there will be Monday lectures with me, okay, in this room, and then we will have 2 labs. So labs on Tuesday and Thursday, because we need to catch up a little bit with the topics shown during the lectures. Okay, so what is shown today, in particular the router, that is very important. I mean, to deploy actual, say, realistic single-page applications, will be addressed in next lab in 1 week. Okay, on Thursday, the 30th of April. Okay, so you already have the slide as usual, and we will, as usual, I would say, have a look at the theory, so a few concepts, and then experiment with the code. Okay, so in particular with the context, there is an example already ready to be used. Okay, you see context here, and for the router, we will instead try to code and develop something. I mean, to include the router inside our applications. Okay. Okay. So let's have a look at the context. Oops. No, that's material, slides, context. As you see, there are not so many slides. It is a sort of globally available props. Okay. Very simple concept, but I mean, let's see where it is useful, okay, in our application. So we start with the idea that React has components. There is a root component. We saw it's app, okay, with the template calls app, and it is the root component in the virtual DOM tree. It is a React component, so it can pass props to other children components. Okay, and you saw that each component can pass props to other children components and so on. Okay, and you see, and you already experimented during the labs. We did it during the lectures. That every time there is a new component, which is a child of an actual component, you have to pass the prop again if you want this prop to appear in the list of props of the child component. Okay, and this is, I mean, good from the point of view of, let's say, making the movement of the information very clear inside the application, because it's a sort of also a way of documenting which information is passed from one component to another and so on. But as you saw probably during the labs, it's also a bit inconvenient, because if you have many levels, many nesting levels for components, every time you have to pass each single prop, okay? Or an object that contains the props and so on, but that's more or less the same. In short, you every time has to pass these props, okay? So, so sometimes it means drilling through many components with several props. Okay, so what you see here with the blue arrow, drilling means making a hole, right? And like you making a hole through all the components, because from here, from the root, you want to arrive at the leaf component. And so how can we improve the situation? I mean, just from the point of view of the developer, because for React, it's more or less the same. I mean, it's just passing an additional prop, okay? It's because sometimes we need to really pass many props many times in many components, sometimes even in all components, or to all components of the application. And so in this case, we need to find a solution that is a bit more efficient from the point of view of the developer, right? So the context API that is provided by React offers a global set of props that are automatically available to lower components in the tree. Okay? So at a certain point we say this component has a context, so it provides a context, and all the children at any level below this component will have these props available for use. Okay? You don't have to declare them explicitly at every level as attributes. Okay? Yeah, we will see there is just a statement to do. There is a hook, use context, and you get a reference to all the props contained in the context. So very simple to use. It's sort of props teleporting, so it's like transporting immediately from one place to another regardless of the position. Okay? Examples. So what is this functionality useful for? It is useful for instance, something that is typically needed by all the components inside the page, inside the application. Okay? Like the visual theme of the whole page. Nowadays, I mean, the sort of fashion that you might want to have an application in dark mode or in light mode, right? You want to have the dark mode for any reason, I mean, saving power, but also because you like it and so on. And this is a property that basically should start from the application and should be available to all the components, because all the components need to know if they need to render with a light or a dark theme. Okay? That's just an example. Another very interesting example, less visual and more technical, is the logged in, logged out status. Okay? At a certain point, we will introduce the authentication. Any web application that is not just doing very, very simple stuff has a mechanism to do authentication, because the application needs to know which user you are when you're using the application, because it has a database that is shared between many users, and maybe these users want to exchange information as well. Okay, so you need to log in, and when you're logged in, you need to see things that are just for you. Okay, it's like when you log in inside your email account, you log in your bank account, you log in on a forum so you can post with your name and so on. Okay, many occasions, the Didattica web portal, the Politecnico web portal, the university web portal has the logged in functionality, because there you can see your information. Okay. And so the page has to structure information in a different way in case you need to access your own information with respect to the case where you just have access to generic information. Okay? So like you enable or disable some portions of the page, you need the information to call remote APIs where you need to get information about your own set of data and so on. Okay? Language support is another typical example. If I know the language, I render the content in a language or another. Okay? Hello or ciao or bonjour or whatever it is. Okay? That's typically a property that you want to have in all components of the application where it is needed. So, I mean, of course, we can pass this as props. That's fine, as we did until now. But if there is a more efficient way, that would be better. And so, who developed React thought about this problem and came up with this solution? Okay, the context. So there are three ingredients, so three elements. Okay, that are useful. I mean, that you need to know actually to use the context. There is a place where you define the context, so you say what is included in the context. As you need a set of props to pass to the children, here you need a set of, let's call them props, because indeed they are props that you want to make available through the context. Okay, so you define a context object and stores it in a reference, and then the definition is just create the context, and the provider decide which value we want to pass. Okay, so first you need to tell React, I want to use the context, so definition. Provider, I want to pass some values, and the consumer, I want to get the values provided by the context. Okay, very intuitive. Okay, and context provider, that's that's the way in which we use it. It's like a sort of React component. It's actually indeed a React component that doesn't render into the DOM as many other components like the fragment and so on. It just, it's in the virtual DOM tree and tells React that everything that is below the component gets the access to the information about the context. And then there is the context consumer, and to consume and to get access to this information, you have two ways, two equivalent techniques. Either a component, which I must tell you is a bit cumbersome to use, so we will not use it. We will see an example, but it's not in the example I provided to you. Or very, very efficient, much more easy to use, to read, and so on. Use a hook, use context to access the context current value, so what I passed here. Okay? And everything is subject to the React rule. So in short, when something changes in the value, React takes charge of re-rendering all the components that depend on the context, as it would do for the properties. Okay? So let's see how to use it, very quickly, and then we will see the example. So React.create context, here you pass a default value. Okay, it's more or less like a state, but differently from the state, this is not a state. You cannot change the value directly. Okay, you can pass callbacks to change states in some components, but the context can contain a state, because the context is not a normal component. Normal component can have use state and so on, that's fine. You can pass the value through the context if you have the context defined and the context provider defined inside the component, that's fine. But you cannot store a state inside the context, okay? So, you need to have a default value. Of course, as in any JavaScript code, here you can leave it empty, and it will be undefined as usual, okay? And I must say, maybe that's the most common option, because typically you set the value at the beginning, and so you don't really care about the default value, so what is set before using it. Okay. It can be, of course, any valid JavaScript type, so it's not uncommon. On the contrary, I would say it's very, very common that this is an object. So you can store many attributes, many what we would call props, right, inside. And then you get a reference, and this reference must be used by the two cores, the two objects, the two components, and that's a proper word for the provider and the consumer. Okay? Components may subscribe, consume to this context. Of course, they need to have access to this reference. Okay? But this is reference that is returned by a function, so you can make a file like a module, include it there, and simply use it when it's needed. So import it in the files when it's needed, as we will do in the code. Okay, very simple to do. Example. So let's see something practical. Create a very simple multi-language application, Italian and English, with a toggle button to change the entire application language. Of course, this is very simple application. There are just two elements. A string, so some text, and the button with something written inside the button itself. But we want to do it with the context just to see how it works. Okay, and of course, in a bigger application that might be more interesting. Okay. So app.jsx, you see function app, we have a state, and as I told you, the state is inside the normal component, it's inside the app. Okay, when you don't know where to put a state, it's very simple, put it in app, so it's available to the whole application. Okay, language set language, you state English, so here we decided to keep a state with the value that is type string. Toggle language, that the event handler, set language, that the function that sets the state, and since it depends on the previous value, it takes a callback, so we rehearse a little bit what we said in last lectures. If the language is English, the new value, the return value is Italian, otherwise it's English. Okay? And then return div class name app, this class name is just for styling, we can ignore it. Welcome button, toggle language, and this button, of course it's a React component, you see the uppercase letter here, yes, which we define somewhere, I don't have it, so let me see the example. I want to show you the code. So we open Visual Studio Code, so we are in the context, okay? Context, let me install. So we can also see the application. Run dev as usual. Open. Okay, so that's the application. Welcome, benvenuti. That's the Italian translation and so on. Okay, but let's have a look at the code. Code is in app, as we say. My button actually, because button, if you use React Bootstrap, is already taken. My button is in components. Components, my button has an on-click toggle language. Okay, so very simple stuff. And then there is the context, and so we'll come back in a minute to the context. Okay, so great. Let me go on and see how to use the context. So, how to use the context? We define a context. React create context, that's all. Empty parameter, so undefined. We don't care about the default value because at a certain point it will be set by somebody, okay? When we do and rewrite the context provider. And you see, this is just a single file. Export default language context. Why do we put it into a single file outside the rest? Because in this way we can import it whenever it's needed, okay? Wherever it's needed. Language context from language context. And it's actually needed both in app and in the my button, okay? As you can see, you can see it in the code, okay? You see, import language context from language context. This is inside the file that contains the button, but it's also inside the file that contains app. Okay, and that's a file language context. Very simple. Okay, you can use JX, JSX. I mean, it doesn't matter that much. JSX is mandatory only if you have JSX components inside. Okay, so you return some JSX somewhere. Otherwise, JS is still fine. Okay, good. How do we use it? So we need to set the value in the provider and we use the value in the consumer. Setting the value in the provider. The component specified a value prop that is available to all nested consumer components, even if they are deeply nested until the leaves below the tree. If you do it in app, of course, it's available to all components below app. That means all the components in your application. Since the mechanism is flexible, you can have multiple contexts in different places in the tree and so on. Of course, you can have more flexible systems, but I wouldn't go into these details because, of course, these are typically for more complex applications than the ones that we are going to see here in this course. Okay, but you can have multiple contexts, even context with the same name that shadows context in the parents and so on. So there are rules that decide what is available at each level. But if you have only one component in the root component of your application, that's very simple. Everything is available everywhere in your application. Okay. So, components specify a value prop in the provider, okay, that is available to all nested consumer components. Consumer must be nested inside the provider, as I told you. If we are in app, I mean, this is true by default. And providers may be nested, each level may override the previous value and so on, but I mean, this is just technicality for more complex situation. And what is important is here, I already told you, when the provider's value changes, all consumers will re-render. That's up to React to implement. Like when a property change, so a props change, it's up to React to call the function of the component and re-render the component. That's the powerfulness of React again. Okay? Good, so let's see how to use it. App, div, and so on, and we need to have the provider here. Language context, that is what we imported here, that's this language context, value equal to, you see, language. Actually, I don't know why we put the 3 dots here. The 3 dots are actually, the language are actually the state, right? So if we look in the code, language, and the language is actually the state, right? So you can pass whatever you want, any value that you think it's appropriate for your context, in particular states, or even functions as you see in this example, okay? Go back to the slides. Good. And then for the consumer, there are two options, as I told you. You have to write use context, that's a hook from React, so you have to import it, of course. The name of the context, okay, so the reference actually to the context more than the name. Of course, the name, if we keep coherency, that's actually the name. And then you get as a return value the value that you passed as value in the context provider. Okay? So the value depends on the closest and closing provider in case there are more than one, but there is just one, and that's a value. Okay? And you can use it. It's just a variable as any other variable. It's like a prop. Okay? Props dot something, and you use it, value. This is not props dot something because it comes from the return value of use context, so it's directly the value. Okay, good. There is no way to create a new context object or create a context provider with hooks. Hooks are reserved, I mean the use context hook is just reserved for using the value, okay? Which is typically the most common situation. You typically have one provider and many places where you use the value. Like one provider in the root and many places around the application where you want to use the value. So it also makes a lot of sense. Okay? There is no use or create a context provider and so on. Okay? You need to specify the context provider in this way. Okay? As a tag. Okay? As it would be actually it is a component with this JSX syntax, a traditional JSX syntax. Okay, good. So that's a complete example. So we have the state. I will update these slides for next year. There is a state, value language, toggle language, good, and const language, use context, language context, okay, and we get this value. And when this value changes because of any reason, like the event handler has changed the state and so on, this button will re-render and it will happen automatically because React knows that this component is using this context, so it is a context consumer. So it monitors the value of the context, and if the value changes with respect to the previous value, it will simply re-render the component. Okay, welcome, that's the other component, and you see language, and we use it to write a different string as we saw in the example, right? Welcome or benvenuti and welcome and so on. Okay, and note that here we don't even care about passing props, right? Why here props is used to pass the toggle language function, just to have a different example than the one that is available through the code. I mean, one thing is passed through props, toggle language, and the other is passed through the context, okay, the actual language, so the value of the state. Here we just need the value of the state, language, use context, and then there is this translation. Translation, I think, is just a global variable. Maybe not the best way of programming, but I mean, we don't really care. These are all constant, so I mean, probably we don't really care too much about this. Okay. So accessing multiple contexts, you use multiple use context. This may happen in your application because, as with the states, it's something that can be useful. I mean, you have a context that contains information about the language, a context that contains information about the rendering. So you want the dark theme, the light theme, and so on. So it makes sense to have two different contexts, okay? Like you separate different values into different states if they are not strictly related, okay? Good. So they work in the same way, okay? You just have to have the reference to the actual content that has been created and then provided up in the virtual DOM tree, okay? Okay, good. How do we change a context value? Well, actually, we already saw it in the example, but I mean, here that's the formal description. We can pass props, but I mean, changing a prop is not permitted, right? Props are read-only. So what we can change is actually just a state. As I told you before, as I told you since the beginning of talking about React, the state belongs only to a component. It cannot belong to a context component, context provider, and so on. Okay, there is no place where you can write it really trivially. Okay, so where do we put the state? Well, we can put the state in the component where we define the content provider. Okay, so it's easily accessible. You use value equal to something, and this something is the value of the state, and that's easy, right? That's what we did until now. Plus, we want to be able to modify the state. It's like in any place in your application, you want to have the possibility to change the presentation mode, dark or light, or the language, and so on. And so you would like to have a function, a method that you can call to change the state. Well, that's great. That's a great idea. And how do you pass it? Either you create a new context, or maybe since they are strictly related to strictly related things, you pass an object instead of a simple value like a string as the value of the context. You see here, pass what you need as the value of the context. Language, that's a string, and toggle language, that's a reference to a function. That's perfectly fine, as you would pass it with props, and we saw it since the beginning when we started seeing states in React. It's fine to pass a function inside a context. Okay, just remember that the state has to be defined inside an actual React component and not the context provider. You cannot do it. Okay, not in the provider itself, not in the context object, and so on. Okay, so you have to define it somewhere in your application. If you don't know where to put it into an app. In app, that is the root, and again put the context provider into app. And so everything is available everywhere inside your DOM tree, virtual DOM tree actually. Okay, of course, this is a really powerful system, because now you start, you know that you can avoid using props, right? You put everything into a context, and there are no props passed around in the application for the components and so on. But of course, this would not be a really good programming style, I would say, approach, okay? Because it defeats the main purpose of creating component, that is portability, okay? You create a component, like when you create a function, you want to reuse the function in different places. If you have a component, you want to be able to use the component into different places. And so if it has an interface that are the props actually passed as the parameters, that's easy. If they have a context, you need to also import the context and know how the context was defined and so on. So it becomes much more difficult to reuse the component. Okay? So indeed, it reduces the purity of functional component, because actually for rendering they use values that doesn't come from props. Okay? So don't use it just for programming laziness. You put everything into the context, so you don't have to put attribute equal to value and so on, and props dot something when you use it and so on. And don't use it to correct design errors. Often refactoring a component tree and moving the state and props up might be a much cleaner solution. But I think this will be obvious, quite obvious to you when you program your React applications. By the way, this is not mandatory for the exam. Okay, you can perfectly submit a solution without using context. We don't require you to use context. Okay, if you use it, and that's because you think it's useful, it's convenient for you, it's easier to program, and so on. Okay, you don't get additional point because you use the context. Okay, because actually just a way to be a little bit more efficient instead of passing props separately. Okay, but I mean, once you have not so many props to pass, it's probably not so much effort to pass props instead of defining a context. Try to use the context in the two cases that we described in the beginning. So we said, there's something global to the application, and you need to use it in many places, it's probably a good way to address the situation and to show that you know the context. That's good, is to use actually a context. Okay? Okay, so okay, covered. Context consumer. I mean, there is also a much less used, but a different way of using the value in the context consumer. That is what was done before having hooks. Okay, so you can write the consumer and then open the curly bracket and have a function that renders something based on the context value. Much more cumbersome to understand, okay, much more difficult to write, to read, and so on. So not recommended, but just for completeness, I show you the example, and you see the difference, right? So here the provider is actually the same. There's no difference because we have no other way of defining the provider than this, okay? You can omit provider, dot provider, that's in your version of React, dot provider is sort of implicit, but for the consumer, if you want to use a component with the, like the, using the JSX markup, actually you need to provide a callback that actually returns JSX. So you see that, I mean, the code is much more complex, right? Even though from the functional point of view that's perfectly equivalent, so it renders exactly the same, but I mean reading it is much more complex, especially when you have more than one context provider, okay? Because you need to nest consumer component, and that they don't help readability of the JSX and so on. And of course defining what is contained as a callback again is something that is difficult to read. Okay, you see the difference between the left and the right. The right uses the hook and the left uses the consumer component. You see the difference, right? So clean on the right, so difficult to read on the left. Even though it's perfectly equivalent from the point of view of the React library. So consumer, a function that takes as a parameter the value of the context and then renders something and so on. And of course you can nest everything inside the JSX, as we say this since the beginning of talking about React. Okay, so that's all about the context. I just finished discussing the context through having a look at the example, a final look at the example. And you see what we passed here. Here we are in app, right? App, there is a context that has been defined in language context, okay? React create context, no default value. Why? Because it's not needed. At first render of app, we already have a value. There's no need to have a default value, okay? Actually, there is a default value, which is undefined, but at first render, we already set a different value. So, I mean, why should we care? And you see what's the value? The value is actually what's inside of the value. So actually you see the double curly bracket, the external curly bracket is just to define a JavaScript context. The internal curly bracket is to create a new object, a JavaScript object. You open the curly bracket and so you can pass two values. Okay, that's the easiest way of passing two different values. You have a key and a value, okay, the object of the object. And so we pass the value, and we can also pass the function, toggle language, that is the function that can be used to change the state. And you see that the state here belongs to app. It doesn't belong to language context, not defined inside the language context and so on. Okay? Because we cannot do it, simply. React will refuse to compile, I mean, Byte, etc. will refuse to compile this JSX if we do it differently. In the components, we have the My button, use context. Remember, we get the object, okay? So, you want to use the object, and the object has two properties, lang and toggle language, okay? Let me see, lang, that's the first attribute, and toggle language, that's the second attribute that we define here. So here is the place where we define what to pass as the value of the context. And here, of course, we use it according, lang and toggle language. Of course, lang is used here. It's assigned to language, so used to recover the translation of what we write inside the button, so on the button itself. And toggle language, that's a function that we call on the on click to change the state. Okay? Here we just again use context, but I mean we don't care about the toggle language. We don't need it. No problem. As you pass a prop, you don't use it. No problem, right? So we just use the language because here there's a paragraph, and we just render the text that corresponds to the language that we passed through the context. Just for completeness, let's see what it contains. Translation just contains an object, right? IT welcome button with the translation in Italian, or N welcome and button with translate in Italian. Okay, so Italian and English. So it's just accessing an array, but just for convenience. I mean, it's not really. I mean, you could have written things directly here, but of course, I mean, for more scalability and more better organization of the application, if you do something more, how to say, more scalable, that is appreciated. Okay. Okay, good. So we saw the application working. Click, click, click. We can also inspect what's happening. Well, no errors in the console, of course. But you can see the context provider. Okay, that's a value passed by the context, and you see there is a value lang and the function. Okay, the function that is the callback used to set the state. And the welcome receives, in terms of hooks, a context, and the my button as well. Okay, and when you click it, the button, you see that the language will change. Okay, and you will see also that the state in app has changed. Okay, I mean, that's what we said until now. You can debug the example and see what is going to happen. Okay, so very simple example, just one state passed as one attribute of the value of the context, and the other attribute is the function used to change the state. Very simple, hopefully. Okay, so that's all about the context. Okay, so very simple to use. Actually, in the past we had a lab about context, but I think, I mean, this is not required for the exam, and I mean, it's quite simple actually. You just define a context, use context, and so on. Probably if you want to use a context, I mean, feel free to use it during the labs for the exam and so on, but I mean, I think we shouldn't spend 1.5 hours just on this topic. Okay? So in case if you have any questions or comments, they are more than welcome. Otherwise, we go further and discuss another important topic that will make us busy until the end of this morning. Okay? That's actually the React router, much more important topic. This is, I mean, not really strictly required for the exam as well, but I would say I've never seen a submission without using the router. Why? Because it's so convenient. Okay, even though if you have just one route, a couple of routes, 3 routes, well, one route, I mean, route is not so useful, but I mean, couple of routes like slash and slash login. Typically, when you have the authentication, you need to use a router. Okay. So the point is that applications have more than one page. Normal web application that you use has more than one page. What is a page? Actually, a page is what you read on the URL bar of the browser, right? So you navigate on a website. Let's try it. Okay. You see here. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean that the GitHub web application is done with React. Probably not. But I mean, if you change the URL, you see that you have different pages and so on. Okay, so each page corresponds to a different URL. That is for sure true in traditional web applications, and actually in single page applications we have a sort of problem that, I mean, everything is created on the client side, and so basically you saw before, right? I mean, we can do whatever we want here, the URL doesn't change. Even in more complex application, this is simple, right? But I mean, even in the other application, I think, yeah, let's have a look at the other. that was the one with the forms, right? Just done on Monday. Let's install, so npm run dev should work. You see, we click, we add the stuff and so on, nothing changes here in the URL, okay? Of course, a small application can handle everything through a state. A bigger application probably wants to use the traditional way of handling pages, views, okay? If you think here it's Facebook, it's blurred, but you recognize it's Facebook, probably the interface is a bit old because the other slides that were created quite a number of years ago. But I mean, if you look at the URL, it changes depending on the view, okay? Not always, I mean, not at every click anything changes and everything changes and so on, but I mean, if you are in different states, it means typically in different views, like landing page, a page with your profile, a page that shows the post and so on, you have different URLs. And this is very, very convenient. Indeed, it's what happened in the old days with traditional web applications, where actually each URL corresponded to a different script on the server. Here we don't have this correspondence because the JavaScript runs on the client and everything is decided on the client. But having the possibility to have this URL is very convenient because you have this concept of pages, and there are disadvantages basically. You can maintain a default web navigation convention, even though it's not recommended to use the back and forth button. We will not use those buttons at the exam, okay? But you can bookmark URLs, for instance. And the application, the single page application, must support this behavior, and we will see how to support it later. Not required for the exam again, just not to overcomplicate things, but in general, in actual web applications that you might want to use, it's good to be able to bookmark some URLs. Bookmark means saving the URL, type in the URL, you get access to the same information, okay? It's like, let's see an example on the Politecnico website. I mean, I think you have let's do it in English. So master degrees programs, and you see you can get it and you can go to the same page, okay? I mean, this is not really a single page application. I mean, it's probably a mix of the things depending on which you're visiting and so on, but I mean, in general it's good because you have the possibility to access directly to certain views of your application, okay? But I mean, we have a problem, right? So actually we always have slash, so no URL here. And how do we solve it? That's the topic for today, okay? So understanding the usefulness, it's here, and having the URLs also allows the URL to convey some information. If you see slash details, this probably means that this is a page that contains details about something. If we can support the URLs in single page application, we avoid reloading the application and also avoid reloading and parsing a lot of JavaScript code at every page change. That is great, okay, from the point of view of the user experience, because things happen much faster. You don't have to query the server and wait for the response from the server. And this is basically a way to keep a state, I mean, not a complete state of the application, but at least the view state, the state that relates to the view of the application across, I mean, in the URL. And if you don't reload the application, you don't have to reload the state of the application, so actually the data and so on in your single page application, okay? So there are, in short, a lot of advantages of replicating the approach of traditional web applications using these URLs, okay? So let's see how can we do this operation, okay? So main list, detail view, sidebar, etc., etc. All use cases, I mean, many use cases where URLs are convenient. So actually, at the moment, we have a problem, right? So any URL we type, let's try, it's here, so /abcd, okay, I just typed abcd in the URL. You see the result is always the same, because the server is configured to return the same exact web application for any URL you might type, okay? And anything that should capture this information of the URL should happen somewhere, either the server or the client. If it's the server, it's a traditional web application. If it's the client, as we will do today, it's the client application that can manage these URLs, but we need the help of some library. Okay, JavaScript gives us access to this information of the URL. You remember the browser object model, and there was properties like location that give you access, reading and writing mode to this URL information. Okay, and so that's a problem that we have, right? I mean, it's not a problem, it's a feature, it's wanted by React. React application will always return the same page that will load and mount the same app. And if we want to use this URL, we must make sure that the URL content is then queried by the app to customize the render. So when the application is loaded, if it's /something else, somebody has to read this something else and decide what to show depending on the content of the URL. Okay? We can do it manually, of course, as any other thing that we already did in JavaScript, but if we have a library or something that can help us, like React or a React library and so on, that's better, right? So now we will see the React route. Okay? So, these problems of defining what to show when you have a different URL on the client side are handled by router libraries. Okay, a JavaScript router manages modifying the location of the app in case we want to modify it, so we can navigate on the client side to a different URL without loading anything from the server, or determining which React component should be rendered at a given location. So in short, when the user does some actions in the application, the router first prevents the browser from fetching other pages from the server, because it's useless. We said in single page application we don't want to do this. Okay, but at the same time we instruct the React application to switch in and out components. So just remove a component and show another component and so on. Think about the example as we showed before. I mean, that's the landing page and you see a welcome component. And then you click and you go into some details, and the React welcome component will be put aside and the detailed component will be rendered. Okay? Of course, we need to tell the router that we want this behavior, which URLs correspond to this behavior, and so on. So we have a lot of things to do, and that's what we do today, okay, in the rest of the morning. But, I mean, in principle, that's what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, or maybe luckily, depending on the point of view, React does not contain a specific router functionality. So we don't have a router library inside React itself. But there are routers compatible with React, and there is one of the most common ones that is called the React Router, unsurprisingly. Very simple to install, npm install React Router, and gives us all the functionalities. We need to understand how to use it. Okay? And this is well maintained, so it's recommended as a router for React. So the features of this library is that connect React app navigation with the browser's native navigation feature. So in principle, we can even use the buttons back, forth, and so on. But I mean, the main feature is to selectively show components according to the current route. So it reads the URL fragment, so the part after the host and the port, which of course that depends on the website we are visiting, but then /abcd, /details, /user, and so on. That's the part that is read by the React library, and this part determines which components are rendered by React. Okay, so it integrates very well with the React rendering system, and it is able to disable or enable the rendering of some components. Of course, we need to declare something. So in short, we need to create routes and say which URL correspond to which components and so on. Okay. So actually, it's easy to integrate and understand because it's written for React. So it uses normal React components. It provides us with new React components that must be used to achieve, the purpose of having this router behavior. To determine what must be rendered, we use a route and routes with the S components. Okay, with some attributes as we will see in a minute. Links, which are a very critical thing in the page, because if we have the anchor tag, we will reload from the server. We don't want to do this in single page application. So if we want to insert a link, that's possible, but we need to use a special tag provided by the React router library that is named link, okay, instead of a that is anchor. Navigate just to render to move to another URL and so on, but we will see them as we need them. It defines three hooks which are defined by the library itself. Use navigate, use parent, use search parent. That's basically to move to other URLs or to handle and to process what's contained inside the URL in a simple way. Okay. To use this library, the whole application must be wrapped into a browser router container. Okay, so it means that over app, we need to include app in this open and closed browser router container component, if you like. Okay. Once we do it, and we will see an example in a minute, and we will type it. So this time we will construct it. We will have the possibility to define, to use this router component that define a set of routes where we have the possibility to define some JSX, that is what is supposed to be rendered depending on the URL. Okay, so let's have a look at this example. We have slash about slash dash, short for dashboard. Okay, slash route. The slash route renders the home component. The slash about renders the about component. The slash dash renders the dashboard component. So these are three different components. Only one of these three will be rendered at a time by React. Okay, through this React router library. Okay. But then, how do we use it? We need to modify this URL. At the moment, we have no way of modifying this URL. There is a way. There is the anchor tag, right? The anchor tag makes you navigate to a different URL. But that's not what we want in the single-page application. In the single-page application, we want the possibility to tell the router we want to change the URL. And that's achieved, as I told you before, with the link tag. Link to, that's an attribute, slash about, slash dash, and so on. And this creates an actual link in the DOM tree. So it's shown as a link, as a real link in the browser window. You click on it, but the router intercepts this click, and it doesn't reload. It doesn't reload the application from the client. Okay, it does the prevent default that we saw last time, and then it just swaps the component. So it re-renders the application, and it goes to check which route corresponds to the new URL slash about dash, and it renders either home or about or dashboard and so on. So in short, in one place, in app, we need to define the routes. Okay, and what we need to show in terms of components for each route. And then around the app, so in any place where it's needed, we can insert either links through the link, so that if the user click, we move to the new URL, Or we will be able to do the same also by clicking on buttons and stuff like that. So every time the user interacts with the application, we see the need for changing the URL. We can do it also in event handlers and so on. So handling clicks and stuff like that. So routers can be quite complex. We will use the simplest mode of this library, which is called the declarative mode, which is what we just saw. Okay, so routes, a list of routes with the URL and with the component that need to be rendered. Okay, and the rest happens automatically. When we need the URL, we insert a link or an event handler that navigate to that link, and that's fine. Okay, so we are not going to see these modes, which are more convenient maybe in bigger applications, because typically every time you change the URL, you might want to reload some data from the server and so on. So, I mean, not the whole application, but changing the data shown to the user and so on. And so the other modes, in short, they can help you to simplify coding these behaviors. Okay, but I mean, in this course, just because it's a basic course and we want to understand the basic principles, we will stick to the simple mode, okay, that is the declarative mode, which is also pretty intuitive, and it does nothing, let's say, automatically that is difficult to understand. Okay, so browser router uses normal URL, and this is what is recommended for modern browsers, what is recommended for this course. Okay, import browser router from React router. Everything is imported, like you import from React Bootstrap, you import from React, and so on. Okay, there is also another router, hash router, for older browser, just in case, but I mean, we will not use it. Okay, I mean, modern browsers are quite good nowadays, and so there's no reason to use this router. But I mean, this information here is here just for completeness, so just to tell you, I mean, we can handle cases in which the user has really old browsers and so on. It requires some server configuration, actually not in our case, not with the React development server that is provided with Byte, because it's already configured correctly. But if you have a server that you configure yourself, a web server that you configure yourself, you must make sure that any URL that is required by the client points to the exact same page. Okay, so basically you should redirect anything / anything to the same content. Okay, that is actually what is happening in the example, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay, already done by Byte. Okay, but I mean, this is because we are using Byte in development mode, so we know that we need to have this behavior, and it's already configured this way. If we buy a web server somewhere, in some places, in the cloud, in the internet, wherever, you need to configure it yourself. So you must make sure you do a correct configuration for this purpose. Okay, but not needed for the course because it's already automatic for us. How do we wrap up in a browser router? Up is actually the main component, right? Actually, up is inside strict mode, it's inside the main JSX, right? So we think that the best place to put the browser router is this main JSX file, because in this way you wrap the whole app. And if you decide to use the router, I mean, you actually want to wrap the whole app, because the whole app is using URLs. You cannot just use URLs for a sub part of the app. It becomes so messy that, I mean, it would be useless, right? The router was born to simplify development, right? So, but I mean, since we have this template, that's the place where we should put the browser router. Otherwise, in app we can inside the browser define the browser router, but then we need another component like up to to develop everything in up to, as we did a few years ago. So, but I think that's the best way of handling the router. That is the only modification we would like to see inside the main JSX. I mean, typically, at the exam, I don't want to see any other modification in main JSX. Leave the strict mode on, which is very useful for debugging purposes, and for development, and we expect it to be enabled at the during the exam, okay? And because it simplifies debugging for you, okay, and for us when we test the application, and browser router if we want to use the router, okay? So we will go and see main.jsx, and we can do it immediately, I think. So React QA router, let me stop it. So React QA router. This is just a copy of the React QA form. Okay, so I just copied that, exactly the same, and all the modification will be done today during the lecture. npm clean install should work, hopefully. npm run dev, make sure it works. Okay, so let me close the rest. Okay, and that's the application that we developed on Monday. Okay, so no router, you see A, B, C, D, and so on, nothing changes, right? And how do we do this modification? You go and do it, right? So we have src main.jsx browser router, right? Browser router. Okay, / browser router, of course. We don't need the AI to do this operation. Import browser router from React router DOM. We need to install the React router DOM, otherwise it doesn't work, right? So save, because you see, if you run it, let's say something is missing, right? React router DOM is missing. So npm install React router DOM. Okay, that's the same application as before. Nothing has changed. We just wrapped the whole application with the React, the browser router, right? ABCD and so on. Nothing changes because we didn't define any route, right? At the moment, we just say we want to use the router, but we didn't do anything yet. We didn't define routes. Okay, so that's done. And then we need to define some routes. So we need to understand how the routes with the S and the route without the S work. Routes with the S is the wrapper component for all the route without the S. And each route can define a path that means the URL and something to render. Okay? Per alternative, only one route can be matched by the router. Okay? Otherwise, you don't know what to render, right? Either 1 or 2 or 3, 4. So each router specifies the URL path matching requirements, /fragment, / news, and so on. And the element contains some JSX to be rendered. Okay? Very simple, I think. It's quite intuitive, right? So router, that's a browser router that we already included in the main.jsx, and routes and route. Okay, route matching methods. Of course, there are a set of rules to decide what to render. In case there's a route, there is a URL that doesn't perfectly match any of the paths that you specified, there are a set of rules. Okay, so a path is made of different URL segments separated by /. There can be a static segment, as we saw, /news, /about, / and so on. It can be a parametric URL. It can be a URL that has some part that is not specified but must be present, like the star. Okay, so anything after docs is fine. It matches this URL. Or / contact us, and so on. It's case sensitive. Okay. No, it is not, case sensitive. I would recommend not to use this option, okay? Don't make the /about uppercase, /about lowercase, because it becomes so messy, okay? So, URLs. I mean, let's try to use I mean, don't care about the case sensitivity, okay? So, I mean, if it's uppercase or lowercase, it doesn't matter. Change the name if you want to have a different route, okay? So if the location URL matches more than one route path, the most specific one is selected, okay? So, of course, anything matches slash. All routes start with slash. But, I mean, we are not going to render slash if somebody has written slash contact us. If somebody has written slash C-O-N, just a part, of course, it doesn't match contact us, doesn't match dog, doesn't match user, and probably it goes to slash, okay? Or slash asterisk, there is like a catch-all URL, okay, in case you want to show not found or something like this, okay? But, I mean, the most specific one is selected, just to make sure that we have URLs that have the same initial part. The one which is longer is the one that is matched. Okay? It makes sense. I mean, nothing really special. We can even nest routes. Routes may follow the layout hierarchy of the interface components. I mean, it's like slash user details, slash user contact information, slash user authentication info, and so on. And that's slash user. And then you have slash posts, slash objects, slash items, slash products, whatever. Okay? You can create a hierarchy of URLs. Okay? And this is supported by the router library. All the paths will be concatenated, and the parent routes will browse recursively through all matching paths inside. Just remember that since you have different levels, you need to define in your components where the children must be rendered, and there is a specific component named outlet that you need to use in your components to show the children of the component. Okay, so it's like you have route slash path layout, and then you have the route nested inside, about and dashboard. So you render the layout because it matches slash at the higher level, and then it's slash about and renders about as well. But where does the about is rendered? Well, in layout you need to remember to use the outlet. If you don't use it, what is written here inside the route that is nested will not be rendered. Okay, just remember it. I mean, if you are in the lab, we can help you. We typically recognize this error. Okay, but I mean, this is just for multiple levels of nesting. With just one level of nesting, everything is fine. You don't need the outlet because you don't have a children component to render together with the parent component. Okay. There are a couple of special routes. The layout route, a route without a path will always be meshed, and it's useful to wrap with the common layout the children's route. Okay, or the no match route, special case path equal to star, and basically this is the least specific path you can write, and it will match only when no other routes do. Okay, so they match. And it can be used, of course, to write a component like the not found component. I'm sorry, this page does not exist. Please go back to the home or whatever. Okay, what you encounter in typical websites often. So these behaviors are supported as well. So you see path, about, dashboard, path, asterisk, no match. Okay, and no match is just a page with some text saying sorry, not found, and so on. Slash. No path, index, element, home. So if there is not slash about, not slash dashboard, but there is slash something, this home will be rendered. Okay, so slash nothing, and this home will be rendered. Okay, sorry, the slash something will be cached by the null match. So slash nothing else, because below you might not want to add anything, not slash slash, because it's not too intuitive, right? And so here the index matches without the path, okay? And of course the outlet is still there. Just a few more instructions, and then I think we can break, and then we dedicate the second part of the lecture to develop our example and transform it into something that uses the route. Okay, so the last piece we are missing, yes, it's navigation. Okay, so we say we have URLs, and now we need to move to those URLs, and you cannot simply type them on the browser URL bar. One, because if you do it, you reload the stuff from the server. We said we don't want it. And second, maybe most important, normal user don't even know there is a URL bar, right? If you ask your grandparents or whatever colleague you have that doesn't know anything about a web application, they didn't even notice there is a URL bar, right? Sometimes it's even hidden, right? Like in mobile application and so on. So people doesn't type there, okay? They type something if they know something like ChatGPT and Google, two websites, so I don't know, maybe 3, Facebook, whatever, okay? But apart from that, they will not care about that URL bar. And so when you move to another URL, you need to have a way to do it from the application. And there are two options. The link component provided by the React Router library. It's like you want to add an anchor tag, href, and so on with the URL. That's in traditional applications. And now you use the link because the link is intercepted by the router library. Or maybe you are in an event handler. In an event handler, you're writing JavaScript code. You're not writing JSX, right? So you cannot return JSX from an event handler. And so you need a function to call in an event handler. And so the React router library provides you this function, and this function is the one that is returned by the useNavigate hook. Okay, so in the beginning of your component, you call useNavigate, you get the function, typically you call it navigate, and then you pass the new URL you want to go to once the event happens. You click on a button, you navigate to /about, to /add, whatever. Okay? Never use a plain hyperlink, anchor tag. Never use form submission. Okay? There is another hook use actions. We are not going to see it during these lectures. React is evolving, so of course it might happen at a certain point there are more interesting functions, and we might want to include them in the course, but for the moment I think it's clear enough if we stick with this simple functionality. So 3 hooks, the use state, use context, and use effect next lecture, plus all these hooks, let's say service hooks, as we saw today, for instance, use navigate, use params, use query params, and so on, that are just meant to simplify processing of some information. Okay, they are called hooks because people like hooks in React. Okay, but they are not really hooks in the sense they are not. They are kind of functions. I think if they call it utility function navigate, that would be the same. Okay, while use state is something that it needs to be deeply integrated in React, right? And the rest of the hooks instead just return functions that are useful for the library. Okay, good. So just an example, and then we will break. Okay, do a break. So function home, you want to include this anchor tag. No anchor tag, we say. Link to / to about / or not /. Well, it depends on where you are in your application. One is an absolute URL, the other is a relative URL. Okay, this depends on where you are in your application, where you want to navigate to. Okay, it's like in normal traditional web applications. You are in an event handler. You see the event handler on submit. That's a form. Could be on click for a button and so on. navigate to slash something, slash invoices, slash new invoice ID, okay? Of course, you cannot just say link. This is JSX, where I'm going to write the JSX here. I can return JSX, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, this is just an event ended that has been queued inside the callback queue of JavaScript, okay? It's not something that has been called by React to decide what to render, okay? So, in an event handler, you need a function to tell the router to move to a different URL. And this function is this navigate that is given by the useNavigate hook, okay? All paths are relative unless they start with slash, but I mean this is quite intuitive, so basically about is relative, depending on where you are with the URL. If you are already on slash invoices, it will go to slash invoices slash about, okay? If we want to go to slash about, in any case, you need to have an absolute URL, slash about, okay? Like the slash, always go to slash regardless of where you are with your URL. So I think I spoke too much, and so I think unless you have any questions, we can break for 10 minutes as usual, and then I think we can start having a look at some code with the Visual Studio Code, and then we will finish the discussion with all the, dynamic routes and so on. But before, finishing the discussion, I want you to see something in practice. So let's define a very simple route and see how it works. And so we understand the need for additional functionalities like the parametric URL and so on. Okay, so I don't see any questions, so thank you for your attention, and we can break for 10 minutes.